You know those mornings, where the sun's just starting to peek over the buildings, painting everything gold? That's how it was at Langston Towers. This place, all glass and steel, it practically shimmered. Inside, it was already buzzing, though kind of a quiet buzz. Everyone was rushing, clutching coffee cups like lifelines, talking about reports and deadlines, the usual corporate stuff. But then there was Amara. Almost invisible, you know? She was always there, in her plain gray uniform, moving through the halls with her mop and bucket. Small, quiet. She just blended in. Like a shadow, really. And honestly, she preferred it that way. Being overlooked meant she could dream. As she polished the marble floors, and they had to be perfect, of course, her mind would just drift. Back to the Philippines. To her childhood. Her mom, a schoolteacher with the warmest smile you could imagine, used to play these old folk songs on a cassette player. And they'd dance. Amara and her mom, twirling around their tiny living room, bare feet thudding softly on the wooden floor. It was pure joy. Those moments were her escape. Dancing was her language, her comfort, her everything. Her mom used to say, "When life feels heavy, Amara, let your feet lighten it. Dance, anak, and the world will follow your rhythm." Anak. It means child in Tagalog. It's a term of endearment. Amara carried that advice, that feeling, in her heart. Even when life got hard. And it did. She never thought she'd end up in America. After her mom passed, it was like a piece of her went missing. She took this huge leap of faith, joining a cousin here, hoping to earn money for her younger siblings back home. But it wasn't the glamorous life she'd pictured. Days cleaning offices, nights with aching muscles and this quiet loneliness in a shared apartment. Still, she never complained. Every dollar she sent home felt like a victory, bringing her siblings closer to a better future. That was enough. But the dream of dancing, it was still there, tucked away in the quiet corners of her mind. Sometimes when the office was completely empty, she'd put down her mop, close her eyes, and just move. Her body remembered the steps, the rhythms her mother had taught her. For those few minutes, she wasn't a janitor. She was Amara, the dancer. It's funny though. Those secret moments, they weren't completely unnoticed. Some of the employees, they'd whisper about the dancing janitor. Amused, maybe a little impressed, by her hidden talent. But no one ever said anything to her face. Except, there was this one guy. His curiosity, it was like a little spark that would eventually set everything on fire. His name was Victor Langston. Langston Towers, it was his building. He was the CEO, the big boss. Enigmatic, wealthy, influential. The whole package. He rarely came in, but when he did, you felt it. Tall, impeccably dressed, radiating this authority. People admired him, feared him, a bit of both. They said he had a sharp mind, and an even sharper tongue. He used humor like a weapon, sometimes, to mask this cruelty. It made people feel small. Amara knew of him, of course. Everyone did. But to her, he was just another name on the long list of people whose offices she cleaned. She had absolutely no idea their paths were about to collide. In a way that would change everything. That morning, she was cleaning the lobby. A group of employees were whispering excitedly near the elevators. "Victor's coming in today," one of them said. "Apparently, he's throwing a party tonight, for some big investors." Amara barely registered it. Parties, CEOs. It was a world away from hers. She had work to do. No time for idle chatter. But as she pushed her cart towards the staff closet, she had this feeling. Like something was different about today. A subtle shift in the air. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, the place transformed. The sterile office became dazzling. Fairy lights everywhere. Tables overflowing with fancy food and drinks. Amara was tasked with cleaning up after the party. She stayed in the background, her mop and broom tucked away, watching the elite mingle. She didn't know it yet, but this party, it wasn't just a celebration for Victor Langston. It was a chance for him to show off, to flaunt his power. And for Amara, it was the beginning of something she couldn't have imagined. Something that would bring her hidden dreams into the spotlight. Whether she was ready or not. Victor made his entrance the way he always did. Like he owned the place. The chatter dipped, heads turned. He was in a navy suit, perfectly tailored of course, looking sharp against the warm glow of the party lights. Two of his senior executives were flanking him, and a bunch of well-dressed investors, all laughing at some joke Victor had cracked. His trademark wit, they called it. "Here comes the man of the hour," one employee muttered to another, as Victor passed by. The CEO, he had this presence. Magnetic, you know? People were drawn to him, but also a little afraid. This party, it wasn't just social. It was a performance. He thrived on being the center of attention, showcasing his success, making sure everyone knew who was in charge. Amara, standing near the staff entrance, watched it all from a distance. She'd just finished cleaning up a spill by the buffet table, and was clutching her cleaning supplies almost like a shield. Victor's booming voice carried across the room, greeting guests, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries. He was so smooth, so in control. "Did you see his watch?" A server whispered to Amara, nudging her gently. "That thing probably cost more than my car." Amara just gave a polite smile. She wasn't interested in the glitz and glamour of Victor Langston's world. To her, he was just another one of those wealthy types who'd never notice someone like me. And that was fine. She preferred to stay invisible, to avoid any unnecessary attention. But things don't always go as planned, right? Seriously, life throws you these curveballs. So the evening's going on, and Victor's working the room, chatting up all the guests and even some of the staff. His eyes, they were sharp, they missed nothing. And then, they landed on Amara, lingering by the far wall. A flicker of curiosity crossed his face. She was different. Not like the polished staff or the glittering guests. Something about her quiet demeanor. It intrigued him. He couldn't quite place it. "Who's that?" Victor asked one of his executives, nodding subtly towards Amara. The man glanced over, then shrugged. "Just one of the janitors, sir. I think her name's Amara." "Amara," Victor repeated, the name rolling off his tongue. A slow smirk spread across his face. "Interesting." The executive frowned, not sure what Victor found so noteworthy. But Victor didn't say anything else, turning back to the group around him. Still, his gaze kept flickering towards Amara, every now and then, like he was formulating a plan. Meanwhile, Amara was just focused on her work, oblivious to the scrutiny. Her thoughts were back home, with her siblings, with the money she needed to send. The party was just another night, another shift. But that subtle change in Victor's demeanor, it was the first ripple. The first sign of the tidal wave that was coming. So later on, everyone's getting ready to eat, and Victor, of course, he gets up on stage to give a toast. He spoke with this practiced charm, like he'd given a million speeches. His words were a blend of humor and inspiration, drawing laughter and applause. "To success," Victor declared, raising his glass. "May we all continue to rise to new heights." The room erupted in cheers, glasses clinking. But as Victor stepped down from the stage, his eyes, they found Amara again. He didn't know why, but something about her unassuming presence, it just captivated him. And Langston, he wasn't the type to leave his curiosity unanswered. What started as a passing glance, it was about to become a moment neither of them would ever forget. The atrium was buzzing. Low hum of conversation, bursts of laughter, the clinking of fine crystal. Amara moved with his practiced grace, balancing her tray carefully as she weaved between tables. She was focused, her steps deliberate, her gaze downcast. Years of being a janitor had taught her to be invisible, and she clung to that. But tonight was different. Victor Langston, perched at the head of the largest table, he just exuded presence. His tailored navy suit gleamed under the chandelier, his booming voice carrying easily over the chatter. With every word, he commanded the room, shifting effortlessly between charm and this biting edge. Tonight, he was in his element, entertaining his esteemed guests with anecdotes that painted him as both a hero and a rogue. Amara had caught his eye earlier, though she hadn't noticed. Victor, he had a way of noticing things others overlooked. Not out of kindness but curiosity. He'd watched her, the way she carried herself, the faint hint of something unspoken in her quiet demeanor. It intrigued him. He couldn't say why. As she approached his table to clear a glass, Victor leaned back in his chair, the corner of his mouth curving into a smirk. Ah, here she is, he said, his voice cutting through the surrounding conversation. The table stilled. All eyes turned to Amara. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the tray. Victor's tone, it was playful, but there was a sharper undercurrent. The unsung hero of the night, he said, gesturing towards her. So, Amara, he says, all smooth and loud. Tell me, how's it feel being the hardest worker here? And the laughter. Ah. It wasn't, like, mean laughter, but it wasn't exactly friendly either. It was that awkward, polite laughter people do when they don't know what else to do. My cheeks burned, I'm sure. I just managed a tight little smile and a mumbled, "Thank you, sir," and tried to back away, hoping to just, disappear. But Victor, oh no, he wasn't done. He leans forward, elbows on the table, and his eyes get all narrow and focused. Like I'm some kind of bug he's studying. I hear something interesting about you, he says, his voice dropping a little, so everyone leans in naturally. People are saying you're a dancer. Is that right? And I just froze. Like, completely. My heart was pounding so hard. My mind was going a mile a minute. How did he know? Who told him? I couldn't even look at him. I just stared at the tablecloth, anywhere but his eyes. It's just something I used to do, I whispered. I could barely hear myself. His smirk got even bigger. Used to? What a waste. Talent like that shouldn't be hidden away. I went to say something, but he cut me off, his voice getting louder again. Why don't you give us a little show? This party could use some spicing up. A murmur, this wave of sound, went through the guests. It was this mix of amusement and discomfort. I could feel my chest getting tight. I shook my head. I'm just here to work, sir, I managed to get out. For a split second, his smile slipped. He looked, I don't know, almost surprised? But then just as quick, it was back to his usual cocky self. Come now, he said, leaning back in his chair. I'll make you a deal. Dance for us, and I'll double your pay for tonight. The offer hung in the air, heavy with expectation. The guests exchanged glances, their discomfort palpable. Amara's fingers curled into fists at her sides. The extra money. It would make a difference. For her family. But the humiliation of performing on command, in front of these people. It felt unbearable. I can't, she said firmly, her voice stronger this time. Victor's expression darkened. His eyes narrowed. His voice took on an edge. Can't? Or won't? Surely you're not afraid. The challenge was clear. His words, a thinly veiled taunt. The tension at the table grew thicker. The guests watched, torn between unease and this morbid curiosity. Amara felt the weight of their stares, the room closing in around her. She took a deep breath. Then, I remembered what my mom always used to say. Never let anyone make you feel small. It was like her voice was right there with me. I took a deep breath, lifted my chin. I could practically feel my spine straightening, and looked right at Victor. Fine, I said, and my voice didn't even shake, which surprised me. I'll do it. The whole place went quiet. Like, dead quiet. I stepped into the middle of the room, and this spotlight, or whatever, was shining right on me. It was like I was all alone, even with all those people watching. Victor leaned back, his smirk returning. Like he'd already won. But as Amara began to move, something shifted. Her first steps were tentative, her body stiff with nerves. But then, the rhythm found her. And she fell into the dance, like it was second nature. Her movements flowed, with a grace and precision that silenced the room. What began as an act of humiliation, it transformed into something profound, something beautiful. By the time she finished, the atrium was utterly silent, save for the faint echo of her last step. Amara stood tall, her chest heaving, her gaze unwavering. And in that moment, she wasn't invisible. She was undeniable. The room sat frozen, every pair of eyes glued to Amara. She stood there under the chandelier's glow, the silence feeling as heavy as the moment, pressing down on her chest. Victor Langston leaned back in his chair, his smug smirk firmly in place. He thought he'd orchestrated the perfect spectacle. Amara's heart was pounding, a deafening drumbeat in her ears. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, steadying herself. You're more than what they see, her mother's voice echoed. The weight of humiliation threatened to pull her under, but she refused to let it. She wouldn't dance for them. She danced for herself. Her first movement was deliberate, her arms lifting with a grace that commanded attention. The crowd, expecting something awkward, something amateurish, they collectively leaned forward. Amara stepped lightly into a traditional Filipino tinikling rhythm, her feet moving with fluid precision. But then, she wove in modern dance techniques, blending tradition with innovation. It was unexpected. Hypnotic. The guests' whispers died. The room became entranced. The air felt electric. Amara's expression transformed. Where there had been hesitation, fear, now there was fire. She wasn't just performing. She was reclaiming herself. Her body told a story. Of sacrifice. Of dreams deferred, but never abandoned. Of resilience in the face of ridicule. As the dance swelled into its crescendo, Victor's smirk, it faded. He sat up, his brow furrowing. For the first time that night, he wasn't in control. This wasn't the spectacle he'd planned. It was something far more powerful. Amara wasn't the butt of his joke. She was the star of the moment. By the time the final movement stilled, the atrium was thick with emotion. Amara stood in the center, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. Her gaze swept the room, taking in the stunned faces. For the first time, she didn't feel invisible. The silence broke. With a single clap. Then another. Soon, the entire room erupted into applause. It was thunderous. Raw. Sincere. Some guests rose to their feet, tears glistening in their eyes. Amara's co-workers, watching from the sidelines, they beamed with pride. Victor remained seated. His expression, unreadable. He clapped slowly, almost begrudgingly. Like he was struggling to reconcile what had just unfolded. This wasn't the outcome he'd anticipated. Amara offered a small nod of acknowledgement to the crowd. Her face was calm, but her spirit, it was soaring. She didn't need their approval. But she felt the shift in the room's energy. A collective recognition of her worth. As she turned to leave the spotlight, a voice called out. That was breathtaking, said a man from the crowd. He wasn't one of Victor's guests, but someone older, dressed simply, yet elegantly. You've got a gift. Truly. The sincerity in his words. It brought tears to Amara's eyes. She smiled softly, murmuring a heartfelt thank you, before stepping back towards the shadows. But she wasn't retreating. Not this time. She was simply readying herself for what was to come. Behind her, Victor sat stiffly, his companions casting uneasy glances his way. For all his wealth, his power, he couldn't diminish what Amara had just proven. She was extraordinary. And no amount of mockery could take that away. Victor Langston sat rigidly, his usual air of dominance, visibly shaken. The applause still echoed, but it wasn't for him. It was for Amara. The crowd's admiration had shifted entirely. Toward the janitor he'd intended to humiliate. For a man used to commanding every room he entered, the unfamiliar sting of irrelevance. It was hard to ignore. He raised his glass, an attempt to mask his discomfort, took a deliberate sip of champagne. His companions, uncertain how to respond, exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a young investor, trying to curry favor, finally broke the silence. Well, that was unexpected, he said, chuckling nervously. She's talented, I suppose. Victor shot him a sidelong glance, his lips pressing into a thin line. The comment landed awkwardly, highlighting what no one at the table dared to say. Amara's performance had eclipsed everything Victor had planned. Across the room, Amara stood with her back to the spotlight, quietly retrieving her cleaning cart. The glow of the chandeliers still bathed her in soft light, but she seemed unaware of it. Her calm composure contrasted sharply with the chaos of emotions stirring in Victor. He leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. Amara, he called out, his voice louder than necessary. The room's buzz quieted. Heads turned to watch. Amara paused, but didn't turn around immediately. When she finally did, her expression was unreadable. She met Victor's gaze, her posture steady, her silence unyielding. That was impressive, he said, his tone carefully measured. but the forced smile on his face couldn't mask the tension in his voice. "I didn't expect to see something like that tonight." Her reply was calm, deliberate. "Thank you, sir," she said, though there was no warmth in her voice. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." Victor cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "You've got quite a gift," he added, almost grudgingly. "Talent like that shouldn't go unnoticed." Amara tilted her head slightly, studying him for a moment. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how she would respond. Then, with quiet confidence, she said, "Everyone has a gift, Mr. Langston. It's how you choose to use it that matters." Her words hung in the air, rippling through the crowd like an unspoken challenge. Victor's confident facade. It cracked, ever so slightly. He shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping against the stem of his glass. The guests began murmuring again, their attention divided between Victor's discomfort and Amara's grace. The dynamic of the evening had shifted entirely. Where there had once been laughter at Amara's expense, there was now a quiet admiration for her courage, her talent. Victor's companions, sensing his unease, tried to redirect the conversation. "So, Victor," one of them began, "tell us more about that big project you mentioned earlier." But Victor wasn't listening. His gaze remained fixed on Amara, who was now calmly gathering her cleaning supplies. For the first time in years, he felt something foreign. A twinge of humility. Her performance hadn't just been a display of skill. It had been a statement. One that left no room for mockery or dismissal. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere around Victor's table grew subdued. The bravado that had defined the group earlier had dissolved, replaced by an awkward silence. Victor's usual charm. It couldn't salvage the night. And he knew it. Meanwhile, Amara finished her tasks with quiet efficiency. She didn't seek further acknowledgement, but the occasional kind word from guests and coworkers brought a soft smile to her face. Each compliment felt like a small validation of her worth. A reminder that she was more than the role she played. Victor finally stood, his movements deliberate, and approached Amara as she prepared to leave. The room watched with bated breath, curious about what he might say. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I misjudged you." Amara regarded him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she nodded once. "Thank you, sir," she replied, her tone polite, but detached. "Have a good evening." With that, she walked away, leaving Victor standing alone in the middle of the atrium. For all his wealth, his influence, he suddenly felt small, dwarfed by the enormity of what he had witnessed. The applause, the admiration, the respect. It had all belonged to Amara. And as she exited the room, her head held high, it was clear to everyone present that she had won the night. The atrium had returned to its usual hum, the night winding down. But the energy, it was different. Amara's performance lingered, a moment of raw authenticity that couldn't be ignored. The last of the guests filtered out, their quiet conversations no longer about Victor Langston's achievements, but about the janitor who had stolen the spotlight. Amara moved through the space with a renewed sense of purpose. Her cleaning cart in tow, but each step felt lighter. The burden of invisibility. It was lifted. Her coworkers, who had always admired her work ethic, now saw her in a new light. Several approached her, with quiet smiles and whispered praise. "You were amazing tonight," one of them said, as she passed by. Another added, "I've never seen anything like that." "You've got a gift, Amara." Their words warmed her, but it wasn't validation she craved. It was freedom. 4 years, she'd worked tirelessly, suppressing her dreams, for the sake of her family. Tonight had reminded her that those dreams were still alive, still worth chasing. As she locked the supply closet for the night, a soft voice called out behind her. "Excuse me, Miss Amara?" She turned to see the older man, in the simple gray suit. The one who'd spoken up after her performance. He wasn't one of Victor's flashy investors. His presence was understated, yet something about him radiated sincerity. "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone polite but guarded. The man smiled warmly. "I didn't get a chance to introduce myself earlier. My name is Charles Barrett. I'm a talent scout and producer. I was deeply moved by your performance tonight." Amara blinked, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a lot. I mean it, Charles continued. What you did tonight. It was extraordinary. Your talent is undeniable. But it's your heart that sets you apart. I'd like to offer you an opportunity. Amara's breath caught. She dreamed of moments like this. But they'd always felt unattainable.